When a narcissist realizes you're done, really done, something terrifying happens. They don't just lose you, they lose the power they thought they would always have over you. And that's when they pull their final move, their last card, the one they believe will snap you right back under their control. But here's the twist. This time, it doesn't work. If you've ever watched a narcissist play their last desperate card, drop a yes in the comments because your story helps someone else recognize the pattern. When a narcissist senses finality, it hits them long before you ever say, "I'm done," because they monitor your emotional temperature constantly. They notice the silence between your responses, the way your tone stops carrying softness, the absence of your old explanations, and the shift in your energy that no longer pours into fixing, soothing, or understanding them. They feel it at a gut level, almost like a withdrawal of oxygen. Narcissists don't rely on words to detect distance. They rely on the loss of emotional access. You pulling back is more threatening to them than any confrontation you could ever deliver. They don't need you to make a dramatic exit. They just need to feel that your emotional investment is no longer guaranteed. This is because their sense of safety is tied to control, not connection. They are always scanning the emotional environment to make sure the power remains in their hands. When your reactions stop feeding them, when your disappointment quiets down, when the fear of losing them disappears from your eyes, they instantly register the threat. They know the relationship dynamic is no longer working in their favor. The shift doesn't feel like a breakup. It feels like a collapse of a system they believed they owned. The narcissist depends on your emotional involvement as proof of their importance. So when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop asking for clarity, when you stop fighting for the relationship, they feel irrelevant in a way they can't tolerate. That's why they react so intensely when they sense the end approaching. They feel the loss of control, the slipping of power, and the disappearance of the emotional supply they once relied on. It's not grief over losing you as a person, it's panic over losing the role you played. Narcissists interpret your detachment as a direct threat to their ego. They're not thinking, "I'm losing someone valuable." They're thinking, "I'm losing someone who makes me feel valuable." That difference is the core of why they become so reactive when they feel you pulling away. They know something is ending, not the relationship, but their ability to influence your emotional world the way they used to. A narcissist's last card is never random. It's calculated, chosen from a long mental archive of what once worked on you. They don't experiment with new tactics. They recycle the exact patterns that previously pulled you back, softened you, confused you, or kept you emotionally tied to them. They know your emotional history with them like a script, and when they feel you're slipping out of their grasp, they reach for the line that used to get the strongest reaction. This is why their final move feels strangely familiar. You've seen it before, just wrapped in more urgency and more emotional theatrics. If guilt worked on you, they'll suddenly become the wounded victim, bringing up how much they need you or how your absence is hurting them. If pity was your weakness, they'll share a tragic story from their past or claim they're falling apart without you. If you once responded to sweetness or nostalgia, they'll resurrect the charming version of themselves you met in the beginning, pretending to rediscover affection, attentiveness, and insight. And if fear or intimidation used to silence you, they'll escalate, shifting to anger, coldness, or unpredictable behavior to jolt you back into the emotional chaos they know you hate. The tactic they choose is deliberately tailored to the emotional vulnerability you once had. They remember which excuse softened your boundaries, which apology broke your resolve, which "I promise I'll change" made you stay longer than you wanted to. The last card is crafted around the exact emotional wound they believe still has influence over you. They don't approach you with sincerity or growth. They approach you with a strategy. What makes this moment so revealing is that they're not trying to reconnect. They're trying to regain dominance. Their urgency isn't love-driven, it's panic-driven. They're afraid of losing their ability to shape your feelings, your reactions, your choices. Their last card is always about recapturing your emotional participation because without it, they have no power. They hope the familiar tactic will trigger the old version of you who cared too much, forgave too easily, or believed their potential more than their behavior. When that doesn't happen, when you don't react the way you used to, their final move collapses. They realize you've outgrown the hook they depended on, and that shift is something they never prepared for. A narcissist escalates when they sense the relationship dynamic collapsing because control, not connection, is the foundation of how they function. They are emotionally wired to maintain dominance, influence, and psychological leverage. So the moment they feel that slipping, they react with intensity. This escalation isn't accidental, it's a survival response. To them, losing control is equivalent to losing identity, stability, and emotional supply. When you begin detaching, when you stop reacting, when you stop being emotionally available, they feel the ground beneath them shifting. It's not your absence they fear, it's the loss of their power over you. This shift triggers a deep insecurity that they spend their entire lives avoiding. Narcissists survive by managing impressions, manipulating emotional environments, and keeping people in predictable roles. When you no longer play the role they assigned you, whether it was caretaker, peacekeeper, audience, or emotional sponge, they panic. Their escalation is an attempt to forcibly reset the dynamic. They may become more affectionate, more apologetic, or more charming than ever before. Or they may swing to anger, accusations, hostility, or emotional volatility. They might love bomb one moment and criticize you the next. The inconsistency is designed to destabilize you so you drift back to the familiar dance. What makes this escalation so confusing is that it mimics intensity that feels like passion, heartbreak, or desperation. But underneath the surface is fear of losing a resource, not fear of losing a relationship. Narcissists don't process the end of a connection with sadness or reflection. They process it with threat analysis. They ask themselves, how do I pull this person back? Not, why did this person feel hurt? They escalate because the collapse of the power dynamic exposes a truth they cannot handle, that someone they believe they controlled has outgrown their influence. This is why their behavior becomes exaggerated, dramatic, or frantic at this stage. They are trying to restore a structure that benefits them. They can't tolerate the idea of no longer mattering, no longer being prioritized, or no longer being the emotional center in someone's life. Escalation is their last attempt to pull the strings as forcefully as possible, hoping one of their tactics will work before you fully disengage. When a narcissist realizes you're emotionally checking out, they often put on a performance of transformation that looks convincing on the surface but has no real depth behind it. This is the moment they suddenly mirror everything you once begged for, everything you hoped they would understand, and everything they refused to give you when you were still emotionally invested. They become attentive, thoughtful, self-aware, and reflective in a way that feels almost uncanny. It's not genuine change, it's a reaction to losing the control they assumed they'd always have. They study the version of themselves you wanted and temporarily become it, not because they've grown, but because they feel their grip slipping. This sudden shift happens because your detachment disrupts the dynamic they relied on. When you stop arguing, stop asking for clarity, and stop seeking reassurance, you remove the emotional fuel they use to keep you entangled. Narcissists aren't motivated by inner accountability or emotional insight, so they don't change for their own development. They change as a tactic to regain access to your feelings. If you always wish they would communicate better, they'll suddenly talk openly. If you wanted consistency, they'll temporarily act consistent. If you longed for empathy, they'll deliver lines that sound empathetic. They're giving you a reflection, not a transformation. This behavior is short-lived because it requires emotional labor they can't sustain. They can't keep pretending to be the person you once wished they were, but they will maintain the performance long enough to pull you back into the cycle. Their sudden self-awareness often shows up in phrases like, "I've been thinking a lot, and I realize what I did," or "I understand your needs now," even though these realizations appear only after your withdrawal. They aren't having breakthroughs. They're trying to stop an exit. What makes this phase so dangerous is that it hits your deepest emotional hunger. It feels like a breakthrough, like the moment everything might finally change. But what you're seeing is manipulation shaped like growth. Once they sense you reconnecting or softening, the performance fades and the old patterns return because they were never replaced. They only resurface to prevent you from leaving. A narcissist studies your emotional vulnerabilities with a level of precision that can feel unsettling once you finally step back and see the pattern. They pay attention to what softens you, what scares you, what comforts you, and what makes you doubt yourself. They notice which wounds from your past shape your reactions, which insecurities make you over-explain, which hopes make you stay longer than you should, and which fears keep you attached. They gather this information over time, not to understand you, but to use you. And when they sense you're finally done, they pull out the one vulnerability they believe still has power. This is why their final attempt feels so personal. They don't come at you with a random strategy. They come at you with the exact emotional pressure point that once kept you tethered. If you had abandonment wounds, they'll say things that trigger your fear of leaving someone behind. If you struggled with guilt, they'll imply you're hurting them or being unfair. If your weakness was needing reassurance, they'll promise the future they refused to give you before. If you once felt responsible for fixing people, they'll portray themselves as broken, lost, or misunderstood. They know your emotional blueprint and they weaponize it. But the paradox is that the moment you're truly done, the moment you've healed enough not to fall for the old patterns, they sense a shift. They realize the tactic that used to work no longer hooks you, and that terrifies them. Your healing threatens the entire power dynamic. Narcissists thrive on keeping old wounds open because those wounds create openings for manipulation. When you finally close those emotional doors, their influence fades. This is why their last card is so desperate and so targeted. They're not fighting for the relationship. They're fighting for their access to your emotional compliance. Your growth ruins their strategy. Your boundaries disrupt their control. And your self-awareness dismantles the blueprint they counted on. They watch you become someone they can no longer control, and that is what breaks them. Not losing you, but losing the ability to use the part of you they once relied on. When a narcissist realizes you're truly done, their panic doesn't show up in the dramatic way you might expect. On the outside, they often look calm, indifferent, or even proud, acting as if your departure means nothing to them. They may appear collected, posting happy photos, pretending to move on quickly, or acting emotionally untouched. But behind that polished exterior is a frantic scramble they don't want anyone to see. Their internal world becomes chaotic because they're facing a loss of control they never prepared for. They don't panic because they love you. They panic because they're losing the psychological power they built their identity around. This internal collapse happens because narcissists depend on emotional supply to regulate their self-esteem. When you pull that supply away, your attention, reactions, concern, affection, or even frustration, they're forced to confront an emptiness they've spent their entire lives avoiding. That emptiness feels like emotional starvation. They feel irrelevant, unseen, powerless. But instead of acknowledging those feelings, they hide them under a mask of superiority or indifference. They tell themselves they can replace you, that you were the problem, that they're better off, all while scrambling emotionally behind closed doors. Their panic is silent but intense. They may obsess over why you left, monitor your social media, ask mutual friends about you, replay conversations, or search for signs that you're still affected. The desperation is internal because showing vulnerability would expose the very weakness they can't tolerate. They can't let you or anyone know that losing you shook them. Outwardly, they might act as if they've already upgraded or as if your absence barely registered. Inwardly, they're dealing with the terror of losing someone they thought they owned emotionally. This split between their outer mask and inner chaos is why their behavior becomes unpredictable. One moment they seem completely detached, and the next they send a subtle message, a nostalgic reminder, or a guilt-driven comment to test if they still have access to you. Their calmness is an illusion designed to protect their ego. The truth is that your emotional detachment destabilized them in a way they can't admit, and the silent panic they experience is proof that your strength changed the dynamic forever. A narcissist's last card is never rooted in love, growth, or genuine emotional understanding. It is rooted entirely in the need to maintain control. When they sense you're done, their final move is crafted to look like care. But beneath the surface, it's simply a desperate attempt to regain influence over your emotions. They don't come back because they've reflected or changed. They come back because they feel their power dissolving. This is why their final attempt feels dramatic, emotional, or unusually intense. It's not love expanding, it's control collapsing. Narcissists understand that genuine connection doesn't motivate them the way it motivates others. They crave admiration, compliance, and emotional access. So when they try to pull you back, they do it through emotional theatrics that imitate love but lack its substance. They might say everything you wanted to hear months or years ago because they know the right words can create confusion. They might shower you with compliments, attention, or tenderness, hoping the sudden contrast from their usual behavior will overwhelm your logic. They may even speak about the future, making promises they have no real intention of keeping simply because it keeps you emotionally engaged for a moment longer. But the more closely you look at their actions, the clearer the pattern becomes. Their last card never includes accountability, consistent change, or a willingness to understand your pain. It doesn't include slowly rebuilding trust or respecting your boundaries. Instead, it revolves around quick emotional hits: shock, guilt, nostalgia, fear, flattery. They choose whatever emotion will get the strongest reaction from you because the goal isn't reconnection. The goal is control rekindled. This moment can be one of the most powerful turning points for you. When you recognize that their last card is not an expression of love but a manipulation disguised as affection, something begins to shift inside you. You stop responding emotionally. You stop believing the performance. You start seeing what was always there behind the curtain. And that realization breaks the spell they counted on. The moment you detach from the illusion is the moment their last card loses all power, because control cannot survive clarity and manipulation cannot survive a person who no longer needs the emotional validation they once sought. A narcissist cannot withstand silence, boundaries, or emotional detachment because those are the very things that take away the power they depend on. When you go quiet, when you stop explaining, when you stop defending, and when you stop reacting, you remove their access to your emotional world. That access is their lifeline. It's how they measure their worth and control the relationship dynamic. Your silence becomes a language they can't manipulate. Your boundaries become walls they can't climb. And your emotional neutrality becomes a mirror reflecting their powerlessness back at them. This is why they interpret your calm withdrawal as a form of attack. It's not that you're hurting them, it's that you're no longer letting them influence you. What truly destabilizes them is that boundaries force them to face themselves. Narcissists spend their lives constructing illusions to avoid accountability, shame, or vulnerability. When you hold firm boundaries, you're saying, without speaking, I see the truth of who you are. That's unbearable for them. They rely on people bending, forgiving, doubting themselves, or craving connection enough to stay. When you no longer provide that, you remove the dynamic that allowed their behavior to thrive. They cannot maintain control over someone who doesn't react. They cannot manipulate someone who doesn't internalize their words. They cannot dominate someone who finally chooses their own peace. Your silence is not passive. It's an active breaking of the cycle. It signals to the narcissist that the version of you who tolerated emotional chaos no longer exists. And once that happens, they have no strategy left. Nothing they throw at you, guilt, pity plays, nostalgia, blame, sudden affection, works anymore, because you're not responding from the same emotional place. The hooks they relied on have been removed. The door they used to walk through emotionally is now closed. This is why your boundaries become their checkmate. You aren't fighting them. You're simply unavailable to be controlled. You aren't trying to change them. You're choosing yourself. Their last card fails not because they didn't try hard enough, but because you finally stepped into clarity. When you stop participating, you break the invisible contract that kept the cycle in motion. And in that moment, they lose the one thing they were never willing to admit they needed: your emotional obedience.